Before I take up the shloka of the evening, I would like to share with you a video in which I was watching. This was on National Geographic program, and there was a neuroscientist, and his name is Richard Davidson, and he was sharing his story. And he said that in 1990s it happened that he went to meet Dalai Lama, and Dalai Lama was curious. He asked him, "What do you do?" And he said, "Sir, I am a neuroscientist." And he said, "What are you working on?" He said, "Sir, I am working on some brain mechanisms to see how the stress, anxiety, fear, they are processed in the brain." And Dalai Lama said, "Oh, that's very good. It's very wonderful." But he said, "Why don't, instead of, studying anxiety and fear, why don't you study compassion, peace, and happiness?" So this gentleman, said in that moment, it did not, all he could say was, "Sir, that is difficult," because he could not, get any answer for that question. But when he went back, he said, "That's an interesting subject, because if you see modern science in modern medicine also, which is actually disease centric, it should be rather health centric. If you see the textbook of medicine, which is very big, it's an encyclopedia of all diseases, but nobody talks about the health. But so this gentleman, he said, he went back and then he started, working with his colleagues on the subject of happiness. And then he said, and as he was sharing, that they did some very simple study in which they asked thousands of people that, okay, whatever you are doing, there were necessarily only two questions which they had to answer. So first question was, what is the task that you are doing? And is your mind focused in the task that you are doing? And the second question was, are you feeling happy? So these were the two questions. And after the compilation of the study, two interesting results came. One was that 48% of the people, when they do a task, they are not focused on what they are doing. Now, this is not a revelation, because from all our experiences, we know that how we do our task. But what came as a next result was actually more of a revelation, which said that when you are not focused, that is, when the mind is wandering, a wandering mind is not a happy mind. Now, this was something which probably since ages, if I talk of Bhagavad Gita now, is a old truth which is always there, but it was only recently that scientifically we could say that a wandering mind, a distracted mind, is not a happy mind, and corollary is equally true that a focused mind is a happy mind. So right in the second chapter, Krishna, when he starts speaking, that was the first chapter actually in which he starts speaking, 66th shloka, he says, "Those with unsettled consciousness have no discrimination. Those who are unmeditative cannot know peace. And for those who lack peace, how is happiness possible?" Because when he's saying unmeditative, he's saying, what does he mean? Because I see that two books are rather very complementary to one another. One is the Bhagavad Gita, and the other is the Patanjali Yoga Sutras. Because we see that Bhagavad Gita, as Swami said, is the essence of Upanishads, which are in return essence of the Vedas. So all the wisdom of the East is condensed into the Upanishads, and from Upanishads it has come to Bhagavad Gita. But Bhagavad Gita basically talks of the philosophy, which is the Sankhya and the Vedanta dominantly, doesn't talk about the how part too much. It is actually in the Patanjali Yoga Sutras that the how part is dealt, right from the first sutra. And Patanjali, in his one of the sutras, he says, which is the first pada, the Samadhi pada, he says that the practice of one pointed concentration is the best way to rise above the obstacles and the physical and mental disturbances that accompany them. Now, if we see these two things together, on one end, Krishna is saying that if you are unmeditative, if you have an unsettled consciousness, you will not know peace. And if you do not know peace, how is happiness possible? And this is exactly what the science is. Science has started, science has rather concluded. Now it is something, there is no ambiguity now. A wandering mind is not a happy mind. So let's see what we can do about it. In fact, scientists also studied that yes, meditation is the best way to focus, as Yogananda defined meditation as nothing but concentration on God or on one aspect of God. And if you see Patanjali also, when he describes the 8 steps pathways, the dhyana is a fruit of dharana, which is to say that concentration, when you start concentrating, the meditation will start following. But people also studied that why is it that people, when they know that meditation is such a beautiful thing, why they leave meditation practices or why they become dropouts. And one of the interesting things which came out was that people after some time start feeling that they start feeling that their meditation is like a work. Because when we think about concentration, 2 things come to our mind. In fact, one is effort, and yes, there is some effort involved. And the other is strain part. We see concentration as a strenuous effort. But what spiritual practices are actually trying to tell us is that we need to de-link these two, the strain from the effort. How can we do that? And I was watching a video of a Buddhist monk some days back, and this monk was explaining very beautifully that if you see any meditation practice, whether it is visualization, whether it is listening to the inner sounds, whether it is watching the breath, there are basically 3 phases happening there in the meditative practice. Let us take the example of breath practice, because that is what we commonly do here in Ananda. So when we start watching the breath or we are chanting the mantra, that is the first phase, that our mind is focused and concentrated on the breath. Now, what happens is that after some time you find that your mind has drifted. Now you don't know at what point it drifted, but you suddenly notice that your mind has drifted. So the second phase is noticing that it has drifted. And the third phase is that you bring it back to the activity that you were doing earlier. If it was breath, you bring it back to the breath. Now he said that many times when people see that their mind is drifting, which it will again and again, they start judging themselves. And this self-judgment creates a lot of resistance and it creates a sense of failure in them. That yes, they are failing. Each time they are failing. And he said many times it is because of this failure consciousness that people drop meditation practices. But what is interesting is that the very property of the mind, which is to drift, can actually bring the fun element into it. Now, how is that possible? It is because when you have a ball, let's say, and you throw it on the wall, it bounces back. You put it on the floor and it bounces back. Imagine what would happen if the ball doesn't bounce. It just goes there and gets stuck there. Nobody would like to play. There is no fun element there. So start seeing your mind also like that ball. It drifts because it is the property. You bring it back. You bring it back gently each time, because noticing also is a part of meditation, because only a person who is aware can notice that his mind is drifted, and it will bring it back. Now, with this simple shift in our consciousness, with our perspective, that I am not failing, but I am playing with my mind, each time I am bringing it back, you will see that each time, even if you do this act 1,000,000 times, each time our mind is gaining strength. And that is what will bring it to that one pointed concentration which Patanjali is talking about here. And what will happen? if our mind becomes one pointed concentration, because you're playing, because in our one of the satsangs we have also shared that neuroscience has, and this is in fact Yogananda also, he mentioned that this is the seat not only of concentration, but is also a seat of intellect and willpower. But the neuroscience is also seeing that this part of the brain is also a seat of is seat of joy, is seat of compassion, is seat of creativity. And Bhagavad Gita, in the immediate shloka before that, is talking exactly that when you do this, you will have the soul bliss. And he says that with the attainment of soul bliss, every vestige of sorrow disappears. Bliss gives perfect discrimination and soon establishes one's consciousness firmly in the self. So when we are saying that bliss gives perfect discrimination, because this is the seat of wisdom also, because Yogananda said that yes, this is the seat of intellect, and if you keep your intellect guided, always bring it to this point, and your mind is focused all the time, then you will naturally attract the right inspiration, the right solutions for whatever problem that we have when we are doing. And this is very interesting, because I was thinking that scientists always like to play with the reason. They are the most reason dominant community, and they are always working with their intellect. And there was this gentleman whom we know that Einstein was one of the greatest scientists in the last century, and often people associate him as one of the people who was a genius. But what I saw was that in one of the letters that Einstein wrote, and he wrote this letter to a Jewish Congress leader, and this letter was written because this gentleman lost his son because of polio. And in order to console him, he wrote this letter. And if you will read this letter, you will be surprised, if you do not know that it was written by a scientist, that whether it was written by a yogi or a priest or a scientist. So let me read that letter for you. He writes that a human being is a part of the whole, called by us universe, which is a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings, as something separated from the rest, which is a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. The striving to free oneself from this delusion is the one issue of true religion. Not to nourish the delusion, but to try to overcome it is the way to attain peace of mind. Now, when we read this letter, it is surprising that how a scientist who was all his years was working with his intellect alone was able to write such a letter, which looks like as if it was written by a yogi. So what is happening here is that if a focused mind, as Swami said, that when you read the word, when you look at the word genius, he said this word has actually come from genie. And a genie, as we know, is somebody who has supernatural powers, who can do anything and you call it and he does it. And Swami said that this word genius, how it has come from genie is that because when we say that somebody genius is not because someone who is slogging with the reason, but someone who is always in that focused state of mind. And in that focused state of mind, he receives the inspiration from the supernatural state or from the superconscious state. And it is then that we say that, oh, that was extraordinary. But that solution or that problem, the answer was always there. As Master at one point said that there is no original thought that you can think at any point of time, because everything is God. Everything is God's thought and God's consciousness, which he has already put there, but it all depends on whether we are in a focused state of mind or not. So that is all which makes the difference. The other point that I wanted to share here was that if this is if this is the seat of joy, this is the seat of concentration, as we know, the seat of will, the seat of discrimination, wisdom, and is also the seat of joy, then when we are in a focused state of mind, it will be but natural that your natural state will become joyful. Your natural, as we always say, that meditation should not be seen as something artificial that we are doing, but meditative state is the most natural state. Meditative state should become a default state for all of us, which can only happen when we see it as a fun activity. You don't see it as a work. You see it as a fun activity. You get, whether if you get 5 minutes, you just dive into it for those 5 minutes. Whether you have 15 minutes, you dive into it for 15 minutes, because you know that wandering mind is not a happy mind. So why to be unhappy? In fact, I love Patanjali's one statement. He said, if you are not happy, that is your problem. Said, Patanjali could not have been more clear than this. He said, if you're not happy, that is your problem. I said, oh yeah, it is something like, having a car, but not using it, because mind and body is like a tool that God has given us. And now if we don't know how to use the car, naturally we won't be able to reach our destination. And even if we are crying that I can't reach my destination, but I'm having the car, somebody will say, why don't you start using it? It is already there. So this is excellent, that with very few changes in our perspective, we can make happiness our natural state. Our happiness should become our default state. That is why we have been created. That is why we sang this thing, that joy, 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 ever new joy. That is our natural soul state. And that can only be seen when we remember that we have come from spirit. And what is spirit? Satchidananda. And Satchidananda is ever conscious, ever new bliss. In fact, it is important that if we are in a natural bliss state, then you can do anything. It is something like, if a child is happy and you tell him, could you please bring me a glass of water, and he will immediately jump and bring you a glass of water for you, because he is happy. But if he's not happy, and if you tell him the same thing to do, chances are that he may not do it. So I was thinking that many of us are in the role of teachers and leaders. The only job what we have to do, as Swami was saying, at one time somebody asked Swamiji, so what is the role of Ananda? And Jyotishji was in fact saying this, I saw that video, and Jyotishji said that at one point he said that Ananda's role is not different from the Yogananda's organization, which is to help people commune with God, self-realization fellowship, to see who they are. At another point, somebody asked Swamiji the same question, and he said, the role of Ananda is to have fun. Now, from outside, these two things seem to be unrelated, but he said that it is actually, if you are happy, which is our natural state, naturally you will like to help the other person. Naturally, because the nature of bliss is to expand. Nature of bliss is to help. Because if you see what is love, as Swami said, love is nothing but bliss in motion. And he said, if you are happy, naturally you would like to help anybody who will come in your vicinity. And I want to read one of the statements of Yogananda, as in the last Satsang, we were talking about why God created this universe. And I want to read the lines which Yogananda said in this, that God who is the ever new, a God who is the absolute bliss, though he had everything from eternity to eternity, he began to think, and these are God's words which he has put in inverted commas, I am all powerful and joy itself, but there is no one else to enjoy me. And then he closes the commas and he says, and he thought as he began to create, he said, I will make souls in my image and clothe them as human beings with free choice to see whether they will seek my material gifts and the temptations of money, wine, and sex, or whether they will seek the million times more intoxicating joy of my consciousness. Now, if you see The whole Leela, now we may say that, okay, what is it? Is 100 billion galaxy universe. I mean, how big is a galaxy? It doesn't stretch over there. How many stars we have? And only today I was reading in the Indian Express that this gentleman who received the Nobel Prize for the physics this year, this was a shared prize, and this gentleman who got this prize, he said that what we see, this 100 billion galaxy, is just 5% of the universe. Because 95% of the universe is dark matter, which only has some indirect effects. And we know that it exists because those indirect effects are visible to the physics people, those who study physics. Now imagine that, all this staggering, how big is this? But when it comes to spirituality, when it comes to the way Yogananda explains it, that God was already existing in his joy, and he said, I created it because I wanted to share my joy with everyone. That's it, nothing. Just forget about those 100 billion galaxies, what is happening, intricate, novel things, whatever, and we are so engrossed in our day-to-day activity. So this is very beautiful. We need to remind ourselves each day that this is just a God's play which is going on. And Swami was always reminding in all the satsangs that please don't take your life seriously. Nothing is happening. This is just a play. And I was thinking that if we make joy our default state, that if we are staying always in a focused state of mind, then it would be good if you start your day. It would be good if you start your day by reminding yourself that I will not step even out of my bed unless I remember that this joy is my natural state, unless I feel that joy. And write it in your room that wandering mind is not a happy mind. And just dive into yourself, focus yourself. In fact, even before doing the energization exercises, if you can just feel that joy first and then do the exercises, you will see that they will have tremendous benefit. And if you do vice versa, because I'm speaking from my experience, if I'm doing it and I'm feeling, oh, what is this I have to do again, rather than energizing you, it will de-energize you. Because the whole experience, because if you're not doing it with joy, it will not happen. So I just want to conclude this with only one thing, that if we always, and it's very simple, that if we stay in a focused state of mind, a focused mind is always happy. And when we stay, in fact, at one point, if you say that, if you carry that joy wherever you are going, just like we were praying in the beginning, even if you do not speak a word, but in your presence, people will feel blessed. Because at one point, Swami said that gifting happiness is the greatest gift that you can give to anybody. Joy to you.